Thank you very much, Professor Kennedy. That was an overly generous introduction, and I appreciate it. The last 3 feet, I'm glad you quoted that because I'm interested in not only talking to you, but also listening to you and having a conversation. So I'll try not to talk too long and so we can have a discussion. And we're a little bit further than 3 feet away, but I'm sure I can hear you perfectly well. I will try to make my remarks a little bit controversial and provocative so that you will have plenty to disagree with or at least comment on. I want to start by thanking not only Professor Kennedy for organizing this event, but also congratulating Professor Kennedy and also Professor Farhad Kazemi for their central role in creating this NYU in Abu Dhabi institution. I admire the tenacity and farsightedness of NYU leadership, including Professor Kazemi, who was in on the beginning of it, to establish an institution that I'm sure will be a bridge between the UAE and the United States of America, and something I believe in deeply. I want to begin my remarks today by talking about America's relations with the Gulf and the Middle East. And I include the Middle East because you can't talk about the Gulf without talking about the greater Middle East. But I'll conclude my remarks with some personal observations about Abu Dhabi, where I once worked as a diplomat. I'm speaking today as a private American citizen who remains concerned about America's role in the region. First of all, American policy, and that's where we start to get controversial. Today, it's fashionable to be pessimistic about the regional political situation and American policy, but let me try to find some reasons for hope. Let us remember that just 2 years ago, when President Barack Obama took office, he sought to change the direction of American policy in the Gulf and the Middle East. He had the support at home, and by the end of the Bush administration, many Americans had become critical of his foreign policies, and they welcomed the change that Barack Obama promised. As a general principle, President Obama stressed the primacy of using diplomacy rather than force, and cooperation rather than confrontation and unilateralism. That was a good sign. He recognized that the use of military force was sometimes needed, but only as a last resort, downgrading it as a priority option. Within that framework, he pursued new policies in 6 major areas. First, and this is familiar to you, but let me go through this and you'll see where I come out on it. First, President Obama advocated diplomatic engagement with Iran. The Bush administration had rejected diplomatic overtures from the Iranian regime and had declared that Tehran was part of an axis of evil. Many people believe Bush sought regime change in Tehran, but Obama sought to shift to engagement instead. During the electoral campaign, he made clear that he favored engagement, even though other candidates, including Hillary Clinton, questioned the approach. Second, President Obama also sought diplomatic engagement with Syria. This, too, was a change because President Bush had withdrawn the U.S. ambassador from Damascus in 2005 and kept the post vacant as part of Bush's confrontational attitude toward the Syrian regime. Obama promised to send an ambassador and to deal with Syria in a normal fashion. Third, President Obama declared that he would make a major effort to help resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, and on his second day in office, he appointed George Mitchell as a special envoy to lead that effort. Obama's declaration was a change because he tackled the issue right at the start of his presidency, unlike his 2 predecessors, who both waited until the 7th year to do so when it was too late. Many experts believe that to make any progress, a president must start early, and Obama did exactly that. Fourth, President Obama declared he would give priority to dealing with the Afghanistan issue, which the Bush administration had neglected when it turned its attention to Iraq. I think Obama was reflecting American opinion that the United States should finish what it started in Afghanistan. He was also determined to counter the terrorist threat from there. Fifth, Obama expressed concern about international terrorism, but he stopped calling it a global war on terror because he did not regard it as a conventional war as much as an effort to combat a criminal activity. This, too, was a different approach. Obama's sixth innovation was to make a clear and unequivocal appeal to Muslims everywhere, and said that clearly that he did want to cooperate with them. Although President Bush had said his administration was not against Islam, many steps that Bush took seemed to be anti-Islamic. For example, his Axis of Evil declaration included 2 Muslim states, Iran and Iraq, one of which he invaded and occupied. Also, Bush's global war on terror, with its visa restrictions and rhetoric, seemed to focus on Muslims, and some of his supporters appeared to demonize Muslims in general. President Obama, unlike Bush, took pains from his first days of his presidency to appeal directly to Muslims, and his speech in Cairo in June 2009 made that very explicit, both in substance and in tone. These then were the 6 major changes of course from Bush's Middle East policy. Obama, of course, also faced a 7th issue, that was Iraq. He had opposed a military intervention in Iraq in the first place, and he wanted to continue the American withdrawal, but he did express concern in that leaving Iraq, we would do so in a manner helpful to the Iraqi people. Obama's new approaches when he took office were welcomed by most Americans and most people around the world. Opinion polling around the world, including the Middle East, showed that American approval ratings and foreign approval ratings went up very substantially at the beginning of his administration. Now, 2 years later, how should we evaluate President Obama's policy in the Middle East and the Gulf? How have his new policies worked out? Well, quite frankly, 2 years after his inauguration, by objective standards, the record of Obama's foreign policy achievements in the Middle East admittedly look rather bleak and show little accomplishment. Moreover, new challenges have piled on top of the burdens that President Bush left him. There are enough reasons to be pessimistic, and I could do that. Opinion polls in the Middle East showed first an upswing in approval for Obama when he took office, but now they show significant declines as people in this region have become very disappointed. For example, polls in 6 Arab countries, including the United Arab Emirates, show that the Arab public opinion of President Obama in 2009 was about 2-to-1 positive, but now it is about 3-to-1 negative. According to these polls, Obama's policy on Israel was the most disappointing aspect of Obama's performance. When pollsters asked the Arab public what was the world's biggest threat, a majority of people in this region, in the Arab region, said the United States was the biggest threat second biggest threat right behind Israel. When pollsters asked what country should be a superpower, if they could choose, they named 5 countries ahead of the United States. And when they asked which foreign leader they admired most, the list of 12 people they named included no Americans, and the top 7 of those 12 included 5 who are openly hostile to America. Chavez, Ahmadinejad, Hassan Nasrallah, Bashar al-Assad, and even bin Laden. Those numbers were not encouraging in Washington. Elsewhere in the world, Obama's numbers are still much better than Bush's, but not in the Gulf or the Middle East. That's an interesting contrast. In politics, policy usually trumps rhetoric. Obama raised hopes in his Cairo speech that he would move more effectively to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict on other issues, but when that did not happen, high expectations faded. Probably, in my opinion, people expected too much. But today I want to express the view of a person who has remained at least somewhat optimistic about the future. Why do I say that? There are several reasons. First, I believe President Obama has the right instincts and the right general approach to the Middle East and the Gulf, and he offers policies that are better than the alternatives that we have seen and that we can think of. So we should not give up hope just yet. That is the practical possible alternatives within the context of the American political situation. Obama has at least 2 more years in office, and he still has time to succeed. 2 years can be a long time in politics. I have some hope also because most Americans have learned, I believe, that diplomacy and cooperation with everyone, even adversaries, is better than unilateralism and the preemptive use of force. America is, of course, the strongest military power on earth. We spend more on the military than all other nations combined. But Americans also know that after the Bush experiments, there's some problems like fighting terrorism, helping to build nations, that cannot be solved by arms alone. Maintaining a strong military force is important, but deploying it sometimes exacerbates our problems. And Americans may be starting to realize that we need to listen more carefully to others, as Obama is really trying to do. But what about the midterm elections that we just had in the United States? Didn't they weaken Obama? Yes. They showed that many Americans, too, were very disappointed in his performance. But the election was not at all about foreign policy. It focused only on domestic issues. The president may still have some leeway in foreign policy. I see some hope because Barack Obama is a man who does not give up easily. He may only have 2 more years because his clock is ticking and he might not be reelected, but he seems to have a stubborn streak and a persistent nature that impels him to continue to do what he believes is right. Let me now review specific foreign policy issues that I mentioned and see if there's any hope in those categories. First of all, Iran. President Obama tried to carry out his promise to engage diplomatically with Tehran by sending messages to Iran's supreme leader, but when Tehran responded, the White House did not regard those responses as forthcoming enough to move ahead. Meanwhile, the Iranian election complicated the situation, adding to his dilemma. Some people suggested he should strongly condemn the election fraud, but he showed restraint to avoid allowing the regime to blame America for its troubles. Yes, Washington has put engagement on hold for the time being. And yes, Washington reverted to sanctions again that have not led to significant Iranian policy revisions. But at least the talk we heard in the past about a possible military strike by the U.S. or Israel seems to me to have diminished as many realize that the so-called military option would be a huge mistake. And the United States participated in direct high-level talks with Iran starting on December 6th after 14 months hiatus. They did not resolve the issues, but my expectation is, and this is something that is a matter of my opinion, you may disagree with, my expectation is that Obama will persist in his policy of engagement whenever the time is right. Syria. Obama's other engagement efforts with Syria have also not materialized. In this case, he faced a new obstacle as well. This time the obstacle came not from Tehran, but from the U.S. Congress. What happened? Obama appointed an experienced American diplomat, Robert Ford, to be the next ambassador to Syria, filling a post that had been empty for 5 years. But 7 U.S. senators from his Republican oppositions blocked Ford's assignment, and that's the case today. Ford has not left for Damascus. The Republican senators criticized diplomacy as appeasement, which is, of course, a very negative word, but they are wrong about that, in my opinion. In fact, a serious dialogue with Bashar al-Assad would bring significant benefits to America. The unexpected roadblock by U.S. senators to engagement was an unfortunate setback to Obama's forward-looking policy toward Syria. His attempt to reach out to Damascus has been stopped, but for the moment, and I expect that he will persist with this engagement as well. I think he'll somehow overcome domestic opposition to it because he knows that it is in America's interest to do so. He knows we need better relations with the Syrian regime. Third, as for reinvigorating the Arab-Israeli peace process, that also did not start well. Obama focused, as you know, at first on Israeli settlements. He said the United States does not accept the settlements, and he called on Israel to stop them. And as you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu refused to stop them. And that added to Obama's problems. It seemed to surprise the president. He again called for an end to settlements, and he tried to initiate direct talks. Both efforts failed. Where are we now? I must admit on this issue, the Arab-Israeli conflict, I'm pessimistic, at least in the short run. But last Friday, as you may know, Secretary Clinton made an important speech in Washington, delivered in front of senior Israeli and Palestinian officials, that contained several new elements that I find encouraging. It's true that Washington has decided not to give priority to ending Israeli settlements. It seems clear that focusing on just one issue didn't work. Instead, Washington is broadening the agenda and now asking the parties to deal with all of the core issues, including borders, security, Jerusalem, water, refugees, as well as settlements. That's a much better approach, in my opinion. Secondly, Secretary of State Clinton said the United States would remain engaged and that American direct involvement in the peace process would even increase. She said the U.S. would not be passive, but would push the parties to present their positions fully, and that the U.S. would also work directly to narrow the gaps and offer its own ideas and what diplomats call bridging proposals. She indicated that the Obama administration feels a sense of urgency and rejected the idea that the conflict could be waited out. I believe these are all welcome changes in the approach. Washington is sometimes accused of sticking to one policy and never giving up trying even though it fails. Secretary Clinton has indicated last Friday that we're changing course, and I think all of the changes that she announced are good ones. She also recognized, and President Obama has said so as well, that the Arab Peace Initiative is crucial in this process, and she said that the Arab states have a pivotal role to play in the peace process. Much of this will not be welcomed by the Israeli government, and there's no guarantee that this approach will succeed, but I believe it is on the right path. It will, of course, take political courage by the leaders of the parties directly concerned and by those in the greater Middle East to insist on a resolution of this problem that has been toxic for all of us. President Obama knows that. I do expect him to pursue the goal of a just solution to this long-standing problem, and I expect he will seek support from Arab friends in doing so, and that is essential. I don't need to remind this audience that on this issue in particular, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the President of the United States must always take account of the factor of American public opinion, and especially the views of the members of Congress. Unlike his predecessor, President Obama has not been afraid to criticize Israel directly, despite pressure from Congress. But everyone knows that the Friends of Israel in Congress have a powerful influence over our policy in the Middle East. That's been so for a long time. It's nothing new. But the discussion today may, I think, be somewhat more balanced now that we have a lobbying organization in the United States called J Street. Some of you have heard of it. J Street has emerged to challenge the very conservative views of other American lobbies and interest groups. J Street advocates a more moderate view, and although it is a Jewish organization, it has been very critical of the Israeli government, and it is gaining some traction in the American political discourse. Its approach, it seems to me, is closer to President Obama's approach, so this may be of some help to him. The next issue, what about Iraq? President Obama has continued the promised withdrawal of American troops, but he's also concerned about the hardships that the Iraqi people are still facing. Shortcomings in the quality of life and security and unresolved dilemma of internal and external refugees are of concern to him. He was opposed to the invasion, but now he seems to feel an obligation to look to the future and do what is right. Iraq is not a front-page story in American media anymore, since Americans have turned their attention elsewhere. But Obama seems to be still engaged and concerned to do what is necessary to be helpful to the Iraqi people. We must stay engaged in a helpful way, and he knows that. By sending Vice President Biden to Iraq frequently, Obama is symbolizing and indicating and signaling that he wants to do just that, to be helpful, and hopefully he will find a way to solidify the relationship and help the Iraqi people. Next issue, Afghanistan. Now, President Obama has tried to deal with the Afghan situation in a responsible way, but he also faces new challenges there. His advisors were frankly divided, and it was amazing that we knew about the divisions, which should have been kept a secret. Even before WikiLeaks, we found out about that. On the one hand, many of his advisors argued that since the Taliban insurgency had revived during the Bush years, the United States should send more American troops to crush the Taliban. They said the Taliban threatened the Afghan government that we supported, and if the Taliban regained power, they would bring al-Qaeda back and reimpose unacceptable social policies. They said we could not let Afghanistan down as we had in the 1990s. Obama was sympathetic to those arguments, but other advisors had a contrary view. They argued that our intervention in Afghanistan should be limited to countering al-Qaeda terrorism, and that had already been accomplished since al-Qaeda had almost completely disappeared from Afghanistan. They said that fighting the Taliban would involve the U.S. in a domestic insurgency and a civil war unrelated to American strategic interests. Was it worth putting more American lives in danger for that purpose? President Obama saw merit in that argument also, and even Vice President Biden opposed a large military surge. Where are we now? Obama did decide to send more troops, but it was significant that in doing so, he did several things that were characteristic of his style and very different from President Bush. First of all, he took months and months to decide on his policy, not a quick decision the way President Bush usually made his decisions. President Obama wanted very carefully to weigh all the costs and benefits, and he saw arguments on both sides. He did not want to make a hasty decision, and when he did send in more troops, he announced that he would start bringing them home in the summer of 2011, indicating that he was not going to be drawn into an even longer war. He also left the door open, and this is important, left the door open to negotiation with the Taliban. Obama felt an obligation to the Afghan people, but also to the American soldiers who were risking their lives. Now, Obama's Afghan policy decisions were further complicated by unexpected new problems, just as his other decisions were. He supports President Karzai and is trying to help strengthen the central government, but fraud in the Afghan election undermined Karzai's legitimacy. What will happen next? Well, we are not sure. American military professionals are predicting eventual success, but this is not yet certain. I believe Obama, of all people, does not want to leave American troops in Afghanistan too long, but he does not want to abandon the Afghan people. My expectation is that he will try very hard to shift the focus of our effort to diplomacy and reconciliation with the insurgents, and that he may have a chance of success if he does that. What about terrorism? I think President Obama is pursuing a sober and reasonable approach to this global menace. He's tough-minded, but less hysterical than his predecessor. Terrorists win if they terrorize us, so we must be vigilant, but we must also avoid an inordinate sense of fear that makes us overreact. After all, the threat to America from al-Qaeda is far less than the threat that America faced in the Cold War. Above all, Obama knows that countering terrorism requires the continued close cooperation of friends like his Arab partners in the Gulf, and he has received that cooperation. The key is to discredit the extremist violent ideology by working with others who also reject it. I think Obama knows that very well. What about Obama's sixth new initiative, his appeal to Muslims around the world? Obama opinion polls show that his Cairo speech in June 2009 received widespread approval and raised hopes that the new relationship between America and Muslims would develop quickly. That has not happened, and today many Muslims are expressing disappointment that Obama has not met those expectations, as you well know. He's also had to deal in this issue with American domestic problems. As you know, after 9/11, some Americans expressed disturbingly negative views about Muslims. The bigotry was confined to a minority, but it has unfortunately not gone away. Recently, some people criticized a New York community center project that includes a mosque because of its proximity to the World Trade Center. That was foolish. Then a Christian minister in Florida named Terry Jones threatened to burn the Koran. Terry Jones had developed an irrational fear of Muslims, although he admitted he has never met a Muslim and he's never read the Koran. He lives in his small, sheltered world, understanding nothing about other religions or other cultures. It is unfortunate that this foolish and misguided man and his incorrect opinions received so much press attention. That's one result of our wired world and instant communication. Just one individual got worldwide attention through the media, but President Obama did not hesitate to denounce Jones in no uncertain terms. I do believe that President Obama will continue to reach out to Muslims everywhere. Just a short time ago, he visited Indonesia, where he specifically reiterated his determination to do so. He's not been deterred by Pastor Terry Jones or other bigoted, ignorant Americans. I'm convinced he believes that the effort to reach across cultures is very important, and he will continue to contribute to that effort. Behind these domestic problems for the American president, quite frankly, is the blunt fact that American public's understanding of circumstances in other countries is very limited. Most Americans know no foreign languages. They've never visited foreign countries. Our media, unfortunately, do not help much. Today, there are very few American correspondents reporting from abroad, and those who do often don't have the expertise they should have in this area. Those of us who have served as diplomats abroad are sometimes dismayed at the ignorance of our compatriots with regard to the rest of the world. So President Obama started with a large foreign policy agenda that was a legacy from the Bush administration, with huge problems that he inherited, and even more problems were added after he took office. And I don't even need to mention WikiLeaks, which was an additional burden to diplomacy. But he's very much aware that America cannot accomplish its goals alone. He badly needs the help and support and advice from the UAE and other friends in the region. America is the sole superpower, but in the 21st century, the threats to all of us from terrorism, instability, injustice, and other problems cannot be countered only by armies winning land battles. Instead, Obama knows that success requires sensible policies, diplomacy, and above all, international cooperation. So we're more than ever dependent on the peoples of this region for support. President Obama I believe, is working in the right direction, but he really needs help from America's friends. We have a lot of common interests with the governments and people in this area, and we should work closely together. So in this very brief review of Obama's foreign policy issues, I've emphasized a few reasons for hope. You may think I'm far too optimistic, but I would rather keep our opportunities for progress in mind so we can work for progress in solving some of these dilemmas rather than sink into despair and do nothing. Now, I would like to turn to some personal observations in conclusion about Abu Dhabi, where I lived for 3 years of my professional life. I was very, very fortunate to have met His Highness Sheikh Zayed. I respect many policies that he and his sons and other UAE leaders have followed. Sheikh Zayed strongly believed in good relations with everyone and the peaceful settlement of disputes. He helped found the Gulf Cooperation Council and kept in close touch with rulers and leaders in other countries, including the United States. He followed the peaceful settlement rule even in difficult circumstances. For example, when I arrived in Abu Dhabi in 1992 to take up my responsibilities here, it was clear that the UAE had a dispute going with Iran over 3 small islands in the Gulf that had been going on for 20 years. It was just heating up again when I arrived, but Sheikh Zayed chose to deal with it peacefully and not try to use force to achieve a solution, although he had support of most of the countries in the world. The dispute is not yet resolved, and the UAE officials have, as recently as a few weeks ago, once again made their case very clear before the United Nations, but they insist on diplomacy and patience rather than the use of force. As a former diplomat, I admire that approach. And following Sheikh Zayed's example, the Abu Dhabi leadership works very closely with its Arab neighbors. Look at its quiet borders. Look at its partnership with Qatar, for example, to import Qatari natural gas through a pipeline, because that's more economical than extracting local gas from under the oil. Abu Dhabi does not hesitate to cooperate when it's useful to the public. That's a lesson many Americans should learn. In other areas of foreign policy also, I think the UAE has shown admirable good sense. The UAE leaders have decided they can develop their economy efficiently and effectively by the judicious use of foreign labor, for example. And so this country, like other Arab countries in the Gulf, depends heavily on foreign workers. Their system works well. When there are complaints about working conditions, they are addressed. Workers are paid considerably more than they would be at home, and it's noteworthy that foreign workers who send reminiscences home also benefit their home countries. In America, we also depend to some extent on the labor of workers who are not citizens, and it remains one of our more contentious issues. Perhaps we could take some lessons from the UAE on how to make it a more orderly process. Unfortunately, most Americans know very little about what is going on inside the UAE. They may know the UAE is a wealthy country, but they do not know what people here do with their money. Americans should be aware of the many far-sighted projects that are now underway in Abu Dhabi, many of which have started after I left this country. Americans should know, for example, about Mubadala, the organization established by the Abu Dhabi government to help diversify the economy and create jobs. As most of you probably know, since you live here, it's a multi-billion-dollar effort that is involved in a whole range of projects beneficial to the people here and elsewhere. Not only is invested in companies in the United States like Advanced Micro Development, California Microprocessor Company, second only to Intel, but Mubadala has also brought sophisticated manufacturing to Abu Dhabi in a number of ways. For example, it created a company called Strata that manufactures airplane parts right here, and just last month, Strata started exporting its first products to customers in Europe. Mubadala has partnered with Sikorsky to create an aircraft repair and maintenance facility. Americans should also know that Abu Dhabi has taken some admirable steps in the energy field. There's a misconception in the United States by most Americans about UAE and energy. Americans probably think the UAE is all about oil. Abu Dhabi exports no oil to the United States, but it's doing several things in the energy field that Americans would admire and respect if they knew about them. First, and most amazing to me, is the pioneering work that Abu Dhabi is doing in the field of renewable energy. The Abu Dhabi government recently decided it must make a concerted effort to research and develop alternate energy sources from solar power, wind, geothermal waste, and so forth. It created the so-called Masdar initiative to do just that. The initiative even includes a visionary project called Masdar City that is intended to run entirely on alternative energy. This city will allow no ordinary cars and will have the goal of zero emissions. It would include the Masdar Institute for Science and Technology that I'm pleased to say is partnering with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to continue research. And it will have a free zone for foreign companies to do research here. The international community has already recognized Masdar City as a very serious pioneering effort in this field by designating designating it as the home base of the new International Renewable Energy Agency, and an organization that has 142 member states. Now, in the United States, many of our politicians give nice-sounding speeches and call for America to be energy independent. That's probably an impossible goal for America. The politicians talk about renewable energy, but they're not working really as hard as Abu Dhabi is, in my opinion. They should come here and learn about the Masdar initiative. I remember when I lived in Abu Dhabi hearing Sheikh Zayed express concern to protect the environment, and he did so. Now his successors are carrying out that important legacy. Another major energy project here that deserves the respect of Americans is the Abu Dhabi nuclear energy program. Abu Dhabi currently produces most of its electricity from natural gas, but energy demands are rising, and the Abu Dhabi leadership is planning for the future when its supplies of natural gas are insufficient. The government has decided to develop its own nuclear energy capacity for peaceful uses to meet growing energy needs. So it signed a contract with an American company and with other companies to help manage the project that will build nuclear power plants here. What is most important to Americans about this effort is that it will have complete transparency and all the safeguards necessary to satisfy Washington and the international community that it will be entirely for peaceful purposes and not for nuclear weapons. Abu Dhabi has already made solid commitments and signed a protocol with the International Atomic Energy Agency and those protocols assure transparency, and those have completely satisfied American officials. Secretary Clinton recently praised Abu Dhabi for that. These are very welcome steps in a part of the world where others are hiding what they are doing in the nuclear field and causing great consternation in the international community. Others should follow Abu Dhabi's example. The Abu Dhabi government has made remarkable steps in other fields as well that outsiders like Americans, other than people like yourselves, should know about. When I lived here, cooperation with the United States in the military field was very strong, and it still is. But since my time, cooperation with the United States and other countries has expanded enormously. In the field of health, for example, when I was here, some people with serious illnesses traveled to the Cleveland Clinic in America. Now the Cleveland Clinic is coming here and establishing a branch right in this city. On the cultural side, Abu Dhabi has planned the Zayed Museum, will soon have the Guggenheim and the Louvre. In education, Abu Dhabi is working to improve its academic program at all academic levels and giving special attention to females. Most Americans, I'm sure, are unaware that the UAE higher education has the highest rate in the Middle East of female participation in higher education. So I want to conclude by saying that as an American, I sincerely admire and appreciate so many of the UAE's foreign policies and its approaches domestically, and I'm glad to have had an opportunity to say so publicly. Thank you very much.
I imagine what a diplomat does is talk in order to resolve problems. And I know it's going to sound like a strange question, but I'm wondering, does diplomacy ever work in resolving terrorism? And I guess I mean that honestly. Is that at all a good idea?
My answer is yes, it can. And the diplomacy is not necessarily direct conversations with terrorists, although if you can isolate those elements that are hostile to the United States but willing to talk from those other elements that are unwilling to talk and unwilling to give up their hostility, which is what we may be trying to do in Afghanistan, then you can make some progress. The diplomacy is useful not directly with terrorists who are unwilling to give up their means of violence and their hostility that that they will never change. The diplomacy is with everybody else. The diplomacy that you use is with the people who are suffering from diplomacy, from terrorism, the people who are suffering as we are from terrorism, who need to be energized and motivated to work with us. Now, even during the Bush administration, when we had the global war on terror, many Arab governments, and I won't be specific, many Arab governments, because I don't want another WikiLeaks story, many Arab governments cooperated with us very quietly to deal with terrorism. They were quiet partly because they didn't like so much of Bush's other policies, but they realized a common interest between their governments and the American government in fighting terrorism. So diplomacy in working with other governments that are threatened by terrorism is terribly useful and terribly important in any action against terrorists. Now, sometimes people ask, and I don't know if this is what you were asking, should we negotiate with terrorists? Our policy, for example, toward Hamas and Hezbollah, our official policy in law is that those organizations are terrorist organizations, so we can't talk with them. My opinion, and it's only my private personal opinion, it's not policy obviously, is that we ought to find a way to talk to those elements in Hamas and Hezbollah that we can work with and isolate the radicals in those organizations. We should find a way to talk to the Taliban who are willing to talk to us and isolate the irreconcilable elements. That's where diplomacy comes in. Now, I don't expect Obama tomorrow morning to start talking to Hamas and Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah, but we should find a way to communicate with them so they know our position and we know theirs. And maybe we can do it through third parties. But again, this goes back to the Congress, which is more hardline usually than the White House and certainly more hardline than the State Department in dealing with organizations like that. And the Congress goes ahead and passes laws identifying whole organizations as being terrorists. Now, what is Hezbollah? In our lexicon and in our law, Hezbollah is terrorist. In Lebanon, it's a party that participates in the government of Lebanon. That's an odd situation, isn't it? And so it seems to me there are some elements in Hezbollah, and this is my own opinion, that we should be talking to. But of course we can't because the Congress has decided that they're all out of bounds. But other people can, and we can talk to other people who talk to Hezbollah. That's a long answer to a good question.
I see that, okay, you have great difficulty to find encouraging signs. But when we think about the facts and the reality, current situations of the world with the economy, global climate change, increasing magnitude of the disasters, so what do you think in the near future will be the situations of these problems that you have listed to us?
You're asking me to predict the outcome?
Yeah, but from the big picture, looking at this, for instance, economic problems, okay, all around, from the global climate change, okay, scarcity of the energy.
I guess I don't have a global answer to your global question. It's very difficult in the first place to predict the future. I can only talk about ways that I think we ought to deal with these individual problems. Now they're interconnected to some extent, and the ones you mentioned are some that I didn't even deal with. But I would recommend a general approach of negotiation, of engagement, of willingness to listen. All of these are characteristics of President Obama's psyche. That's his makeup. That's his natural characteristic. They were not characteristics of his predecessor. So I'm encouraged by seeing him trying to deal with these problems, and I hope everybody will encourage him to keep at it, because that's the approach. As I said, Sheikh Zayed believed in peaceful resolution of disputes, of patience, of listening, of dealing with people on a respectful and respectable basis. I think Obama has the same attitude. And I can't predict the outcome of any of these issues, but I think we're on the right track with Obama in the White House. Obviously, we don't know how long he'll stay there, but my only argument is to say that we all ought to encourage him rather than pointing out all of the problems. He knows the problems pretty well.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The question really that I have is very kind of briefly. You gave us a very eloquent difference, kind of compare and contrast between Obama and Bush. The two presidents certainly are very different. I would agree with that as someone who navigates the corridors of Washington. But who is the, and you'll appreciate that as someone who does a lot of, or has a lot of interest in public diplomacy, who does this work for the administration that outreach all of the rest of the Arab world, the Muslim world in general, not just the English-speaking, few who can be fortunate enough to sit in this auditorium. Certainly, if there is someone in Washington who does that, they are not doing a good job at it, because a disturbing majority in the Muslim world think that there is no difference really between President Obama and President Bush, according to the numbers and the polls we see. And there is part of it is what you highlighted quite correctly, that on the policy rather than the rhetoric, there isn't really much of a difference or accomplishments. But also, I think those differences that, at least in the intent and on the less visible changes and differences in the actual policies and achievements, they are not known around the Muslim world. And I think the failing there is, in the court of whoever is supposed to do an outreach and make them clear to the rest of the Muslim world that doesn't read English probably, or doesn't follow the US closely. And maybe your thoughts on that.
Thank you for that question. Today, I used to work in public diplomacy when I was in government, but I left government some years ago. And since I left, the task has become more difficult because of the information revolution and instant communication around the world, satellite television and websites and all of that. So for the American government to get a word in edgewise, to be part of that discussion is a huge task. It can be done to some extent by Obama himself and by Hillary Clinton, and they have, based on their domestic political experience, done a lot of public speaking around the world. They've had town hall meetings all over the world. Hillary Clinton has traveled more than any of her recent predecessors, and done more meetings with people, and had public sessions than her predecessors. So she's working on it. And of course, there are American embassy officials around the world who are working at this 24/7, who are trying to meet with the public and trying to explain what Obama is doing. But it's a huge task. I think it occurs to me that one of the problems in the recent development of criticism of Obama in this part of the world, and as I say, it's not so bad in other parts of the world. Criticism in this part of the world comes down to this, that when Obama made his speech in June of '09 in Cairo, he laid out a program and dealt with issues across the board that people were glad to hear about. And the listeners in this part of the world heard something different from what I heard. They heard him talk about issues that they care about deeply: the peace process, relations with Islam, and so on. And they assumed that because he was elected, and maybe you would disagree with this, but I think what happened is that they assumed, listening to Obama in June of '09, speaking from Cairo about their issues, that they said, here is a man who is now president of the only superpower, who was elected by an enormous margin and is replacing a man that even the American public rejected. Now he's going to fix everything. He has the power. He's the President of the United States. Obviously, President of the United States can do anything. President of the United States is going to fix the peace process, going to fix Afghanistan, going to fix Iraq, going to fix terrorism, and on and on. And he's going to do it quickly. Now, when he didn't do it, they said, what happened? We misunderstood. He failed us. I didn't hear him promise to do it within a year or 2 years. I didn't hear him promise to solve anything. I heard him promise to try. I heard him say, my approach is engagement. My approach is listening. My approach is good relations with Muslims around the world. That's what I heard. And I said to myself, this is going to work better, much better, than the approach of his predecessor. I didn't say he's going to fix it. I've been watching the Arab-Israeli issue for a long time, and I know that no president can solve it overnight. I'm disappointed in his initial choice of tactics, and as I mentioned, but I think he's persisting, and I think that he's got the right attitude. And my expectations actually haven't been disappointed, because I knew how big the challenge was, and I knew that he had no magic wand, that he had no secret way to snap his fingers and get it all done quickly. So there's, I think, a misperception, or there are differing perceptions between the people in this part of the world and people in America about what the president could do. Now, a lot of Americans are disappointed that he didn't solve all the problems, and that he didn't solve the financial problems at home, and that he didn't solve immigration and all of those things. I think they expect too much.
You mentioned perceptions. Perceptions are very important in our part of the world, as it is even in the United States. What's your opinion, being in Washington, of the recent offer by the administration to the Israelis of $3 billion worth of arms and equipments for a very short 90-day stay on expansion of settlements? The perception to us is that, you mentioned the talk that President Obama gave in Cairo. For us, it's not that 2-year period that he has tried to engage. It's an accumulation of over 50 years. We are now at this point. So we don't understand that every 4 years the government changes in America. But more specifically, to the point of the $3 billion, what's the perception in Washington, and how that differs completely from what we can probably understand from that? Your comment, sir.
I knew you would ask a tough question, Mohammed. In my personal opinion, that deal, which fell through, was a terrible mistake. We should never have gone that route. As you indicate, that was to buy a little bit of time at a huge price, and it would have been so easy for the recipient of the generosity to put it in his pocket and do nothing. Again, it was a mistake like the focus on settlements, a tactical mistake. I don't know why he tried it at that point. It didn't make any sense to me, and most of my friends who watch the peace process and these things thought it was a terrible mistake. And there have been articles written in newspapers that said this was an awful thing to even contemplate. So yeah, he's not free of errors. I'm not arguing that. He has made mistakes. Even you can argue that maybe his approach to Afghanistan was a wrong choice. But I'm hoping that he'll stay in long enough to minimize the tactical errors. The Congress, of course, thought that was a terrific idea, the proposal that you mentioned, many members of Congress. Friends of Israel thought it was a wonderful idea. But looking at it objectively as part of the peace process, it was the wrong thing to do. And I hope that that's not going to happen again, because it wouldn't have gotten us anywhere. So that hopefully is behind us.